The young man came to my door on a January morning in 1931 with Dakota clay still on his boots and a question he did not know how to ask. His name was Carl Hofer. He had bought the old Voss homestead the previous autumn, 80 acres of the original 160, the southwest parcel, the better ground. He was 26 years old and had the particular confidence of a man who has just signed his first land deed, the kind that makes him feel he understands what he is standing on. He did not understand what he was standing on. I made coffee and told him to sit down, and he sat the way young men sit when they are in a hurry, but are too polite to say so, forward on the chair, coat still buttoned. He had found a foundation that morning, turning sod in the southwest corner of the property with his new plow. A rectangle of compressed earth walls, partially collapsed, set 4 feet below grade. He thought it might be a root cellar. He had come to ask me because he knew I was old enough to know things and lived close enough to have known the people who left it. I asked him which corner of the property exactly. Southwest, he said. I nodded. I told him that was where the winter light was best, where the afternoon sun came in low and long from December through February, reaching into any south-facing opening like a hand laid flat against the cold. He did not understand why that mattered. I told him it would take a while to explain. He looked at the door once, then back at me, and unbuttoned his coat. I took down a small wooden box from the shelf above the kitchen window. Inside it, a notebook with water-stained covers, its pages still holding the careful figures of a woman who had been educated in Prussia and never lost the habit of precision. A handful of dried cattail fiber, pale and soft as old wool. A carpenter's pencil worn to the last inch, which I had sharpened so many times over so many years that the wood had taken on the shape of my grip. These things had belonged to my grandmother, Ingrid Voss. She had built that foundation in the autumn of 1880 in 11 weeks, with a borrowed spade and the knowledge of a man who had been dead for 20 years. When the worst winter Dakota had recorded arrived that December, the foundation did not fail her. And the 6 people who sheltered inside it on the coldest night of that winter, people who had no particular right to survive it, are lying in churchyards today instead of fields. That is the difference a wall makes when the wall is built correctly. That is what Carl's plow had turned up in the southwest corner of his new property. I told him he should not plow it under. He asked me why not. I opened the notebook and set it on the table between us, and I began. You have to understand what the Dakota Plains were in 1880, because the land does not look now the way it looked then, and the looking of it then was the whole problem. There were no trees to speak of, not in the way a person from Ohio or Pennsylvania means when they say trees, the kind that stand in groves, that can be felled and milled, that give you 40 feet of usable lumber from a single trunk. What grew along the James River were cottonwood and willow, both of them soft-wooded and crooked, good for burning, but poor for building. The nearest proper lumber yard was 61 miles south of the Voss property, and in autumn, with the roads going soft and then hard again in the wrong sequence, 61 miles was not a distance. It was a season. The Mennonite families who had settled the James River corridor since the early 1870s built their homes from what they could afford to haul. Frame construction mostly. Pine boards shipped up from Yankton, single or double layer, with whatever batting they could manage between the walls. Some families had done well enough to add interior plaster. Most had not. A Dakota winter in a single-layer pine frame house is an education in the difference between a wall and an idea of a wall. The cold does not break through, it seeps. It finds every gap around every window frame, every knothole that has dried and shrunk, every joint where 2 boards meet and do not quite meet. You can feel it with your hand from 6 feet away on the bad nights, a current of cold air moving through the room as though the wall were a suggestion rather than a structure. The old hands in the territory had a formula for survival that everyone repeated and everyone understood. 4 cords of hardwood minimum, frame walls with interior plaster on all four sides, and a kitchen stove that could hold a fire through the night without feeding. If you had those three things by the 1st of December, you had a reasonable chance at March. If you were short on any one of them, you began making calculations of a different kind. Heinrich Voss had planned to plaster the north wall of their house before the first frost of 1880. He died on the 14th of July before he got to it. I want to be careful about how I tell you who my grandmother was, because it is easy to make a person into a symbol when enough years have passed, and she was never a symbol. She was a woman of 54 who had spent 19 years breaking and farming 160 acres of Dakota prairie with her husband, and when her husband died, she got up the next morning and kept going because there was no mechanism available to her for doing otherwise. Ingrid Voss had come to America in 1861 from the Vistula Delta, a low, flat, river-threaded country in Prussia where the winters came hard off the Baltic and where the practical question of how to keep a family warm through January was not a philosophical matter. Her father had been a builder of agricultural storage structures, granaries, root houses, livestock shelters. He built them to hold temperature, to keep grain from freezing, to keep seed stock viable, to keep the things a farming community depended on through seasons that had no patience for poor construction. He had taught his children by the simplest method available, which is to say he had put tools in their hands and set them to work beside him and explained things only when he needed them to understand a decision, not as a general principle, but as a specific fact. This stone goes here because of how it locks with the one below it. This mixture dries slower in damp weather and must be given 4 days instead of 2. My grandmother had learned in that manner, which is a slower form of learning than reading, but a more durable one, because it lives in the hands rather than the memory, and the hands are harder to argue with. She was, in the way of many people who know a great deal about practical matters, not immediately legible as a person of knowledge. She did not discuss what she knew. She did not explain herself ahead of the explanation being warranted. She had the particular patience of someone who has learned that most arguments resolve themselves if you give them enough time and enough evidence. When 2 men from the community came to her in August, 3 weeks after Heinrich's burial, and offered to buy her land at what they represented as a fair price, they were not unkind. They simply assumed that a woman alone could not manage what a man and woman together had barely managed. She listened to them without interrupting. She told them she would think about it. She thought about it for 1 day. Then she sent word that she was not selling. The community interpreted this as grief making her irrational. It was not grief. It was arithmetic. The land was worth more than the offer by a margin she had calculated precisely, and she was a better builder than any of them knew, and she had 11 weeks before the ground froze, and she intended to use them. She spent the first 7 of those 11 weeks doing something that looked, to anyone passing on the road, like nothing at all. She walked her land. Every morning for a week she went out at first light and walked the perimeter and then the interior of the property, not with a tool in her hand, but with her eyes on the ground. She was reading the land the way her father had read building sites beside the Vistula, looking at how water moved across the surface after rain, where the low ground was, where the clay ran heavy, and where it thinned into grit, which way the prevailing wind came, and what it struck first, and what it found shelter behind. She was looking for a specific set of conditions: ground that was low enough to offer below-grade construction, clay dense enough to hold compressed form, and an orientation that would put a south-facing opening in line with the winter sun's low arc. She found it on the 7th day, southwest corner of the property. A slight natural depression, 18 inches below the grade of the surrounding field, where the clay ran dark and heavy to a depth she tested by driving a fence stake and reading the resistance. Good clay all the way down to 5 feet. She stood there for a long time looking at it. Then she went to borrow a spade from her neighbor. Lars Bergström was a Swede who had homesteaded the adjacent parcel since 1871, a methodical, careful farmer who had survived 2 hard winters through a combination of adequate preparation and Swedish stubbornness, and who had, in the way of methodical, careful people, strong opinions about what adequate preparation looked like. He lent her the spade without hesitation. He would have lent her anything she needed in those weeks after Heinrich died, because he was a decent man, and she was a neighbor in difficulty. What he could not do, and did not do, was take seriously what she told him she was going to build. He stopped his horse at the fence line on the second morning of her excavation. The depression in the southwest corner now had a rectangle of stakes marking out a footprint of 18 feet by 22, and Ingrid was 4 hours into digging the foundation trench, moving Dakota clay in steady loads with the practiced efficiency of someone who knew exactly how much work remained and had already made peace with it. "What are you digging, Mrs. Voss?" She did not look up. Foundation. He looked at the staked outline. For what? House? He sat on his horse for a moment. The rectangle was large, larger than a root cellar, smaller than any frame house he had seen going up in the territory. "That's a big root cellar," he said finally, which was not a question, and rode on. By the end of the week, the story moving through the settlement was that the widow Voss had gone strange with grief and was digging a hole in her field. People said it with a kind of soft pity that is worse than contempt, because it forecloses the possibility that the person knows something you do not. They were not malicious. They simply could not reconcile what they were seeing. A 54-year-old woman alone with a spade in a prairie field in October, with any category of activity they recognized as purposeful. My grandmother continued digging. She moved approximately 2 cubic yards of earth on the first day. Her hands blistered on the third day, and she wrapped them with cloth and kept going. By the end of the first week, she was 18 inches down across the full footprint, and the clay she was removing was going into a pile to her east that she shaped with deliberate care, because she already knew she was going to need it. She had not yet explained this to anyone. She did not, as a general practice, explain things before they were built. What she was building, what that clay was for, what the hole in the ground was going to become, and why it would matter so much when January arrived with temperatures that stopped the James River solid and kept it stopped for 6 weeks. That is what I am here to tell you. But first you need to understand what she went to look at along the river bottom on the 8th day of October, and what she saw there that no one else in the settlement had thought to see in 19 years of walking past it. That is where the real story begins. The James River in early October is not a dramatic thing. It does not move fast. It does not cut deep. It runs through the Dakota Plain in long, unhurried curves, shallow enough in late summer to wade across at the bends, its banks lined with the particular vegetation of slow water in cold country, willow scrub, stands of bulrush, and the cattails that grew in dense colonies wherever the ground stayed wet long enough to encourage them. The settlers who had come to farm the James River corridor over the previous decade largely ignored the cattail stands. They were not timber. They were not forage. They grew where the ground was too soft to cultivate, and they shed their seed heads in autumn in great slow drifts of white fiber that caught on clothing and fences and were generally considered a nuisance. A man trying to drain a low field cursed them. A woman trying to keep a kitchen garden clear of their creeping roots cursed them differently, but with equal feeling. My grandmother had walked past the cattail stands along the James River bottom for 19 years. On the 8th of October, 1880, she walked out to them and stopped and looked at them as though she had never seen them before. What she was seeing, what she had suddenly remembered seeing, which is a different thing, was her father's hands. Specifically, she was seeing the motion her father's hands made when he processed cattail pith for use in the walls of a grain storage building he had constructed along the Vistula in the spring of 1840, when Ingrid was 14 years old and had been assigned to work beside him that season because her older sisters had other obligations, and a builder always needed another pair of hands, regardless of whose they were. The processing was simple. You cut the stalks in late summer or early autumn, When the pith had dried inside the outer sheath, you stripped the outer layer away. What remained was a column of material that looked something like coarse wool, fibrous, compressible, light, and which her father had taught her to mix with wet clay at a specific ratio she could not quite recover from memory as a number, but could recover as a sensation. The mixture should feel, when pressed between the palms, like bread dough that has been left to rise slightly too long. Not sticky, not crumbling, something between. Her father called the technique Schilfdämmung, reed insulation. It was not his invention. It was old when his father had taught it to him, old in the way that solutions to cold winters are old, which is to say as old as the cold itself, refined over generations of people who could not afford to be wrong about warmth. The principle was straightforward, though the word straightforward does not do justice to the generations of cold winters that had refined it into a principle. Cattail fiber, when mixed into clay at the correct ratio and compressed into blocks, creates within the dried material millions of small air pockets, spaces too tiny to see but cumulatively significant. Air conducts heat poorly. A wall full of trapped air is a wall that slows the movement of cold into a room and warmth out of it with a thoroughness that no simple clay wall achieves. The clay provides mass and structure. The fiber provides the interruption. Together they accomplish what neither does alone. My grandmother stood at the edge of the cattail stand along the James River and understood with the particular clarity that comes when a memory and a present problem align precisely that she was looking at the material she needed. She cut a bundle of stalks that afternoon, more than she needed for testing, less than she would eventually need for building. She carried them back to the homestead on her shoulder, walking the half-mile with the stalks dragging behind her, their dried seed heads leaving a thin white trail across the October grass. She spent 3 days on what I would call experiments, though she would not have used that word. She would have said she was remembering. She set up a drying area in the lee of the old barn, a canvas stretched between 2 fence posts to break the wind, beneath which she laid the cut stalks in a single layer on a platform of rough boards. 2 days of dry October sun finished what the summer had begun. When she stripped the outer sheath from a dried stalk, the pith inside separated into fiber with a sound like the tearing of old cloth. She made her first test block on the morning of the 11th of October. She had already dug enough clay from the foundation trench to fill a wooden form Henrik had built years ago for casting fence post footings, a simple open box 8 inches wide and 12 inches long and 6 inches deep. She mixed the clay with water from the well until it reached the consistency she was looking for. Then she added fiber, stripped pith pulled apart by hand into loose clumps, and worked it through the clay with both hands, the way you work fat into flour for pastry, until the fiber was distributed evenly through the mass. She pressed the mixture into the form, tamped it down firmly to eliminate voids, and set it in the sun to cure. She made a second block with more fiber, a third with less. She mixed the second batch slightly drier, the third slightly wetter. She set all 3 forms in a row and marked them with scratches on the wood, 1 mark, 2 marks, 3 marks, so she would know which was which when they came out. Then she waited. The blocks needed 2 full days of dry weather to set enough to handle. She used the time to continue excavating. The foundation trench was now 2 feet deep across the full footprint. The clay coming out of the ground was darker at this depth, denser, with less grit and more of the fine particled heavy clay that her father had always sought out for wall construction. Good material. Better than the surface clay, which had too much organic matter mixed in from years of root growth and tended to crack as it dried. On the morning of the 13th, she lifted the blocks from their forms. What she did next is the detail I have always found most useful when I try to explain who she was. She did not look at the blocks with any particular attention to how they appeared, whether they were smooth, whether the fibers showed at the surface, whether the color was even. She held each one in both hands for a moment, feeling the weight. Then she held each one against her left cheek, one after the other, for a count of approximately 60. The morning air was 31 degrees. She stood outside in it with 3 clay blocks held in sequence against her face. The plain clay block, no fiber, the 4th block she had made as a comparison, felt cold in the way stone feels cold, which is immediate and deep. You feel it first on the surface of your skin, and then, after a moment, you feel it in the bone behind. The fiber blocks were different. The difference was not dramatic. This was not the difference between cold and warm, but the difference between 2 kinds of cold, which requires a more careful kind of attention to distinguish. The fiber blocks felt cold at the surface and then stopped. The cold did not travel inward in the same way. It was as though the block were 2 things at once, a cold exterior and an interior that was simply and quietly indifferent to the temperature of the air around it. She tested each fiber block the same way. The 2nd block, middle ratio, medium fiber content, was the best of the 3, not dramatically better, measurably better. She knew this not because she could measure it with any instrument, but because her skin told her so, and her skin had 30 years of handling building materials in cold weather and had never, in her experience, been wrong about what it felt. She built 4 more blocks to the 2nd ratio, set them to cure, made a note in the small notebook she had begun keeping, not of the ratio itself, because she could not express it as a number, but of the sensation she was looking for, like bread dough risen slightly too long. The block should feel held against the face in cold air, cool but not deeply cold. The cold should not travel. That is the entry. I have read it perhaps 100 times. It is the most precise description of an insulation test I have encountered in 50 years of carpentry, and it was written by a woman who had no word for the principle she was demonstrating and did not need one because she was not trying to explain it to anyone. She was trying to remember it correctly. The digging continued through the 3rd week of October. The earth house, as her father had called the semi-subterranean structures he built for grain storage along the Vistula, was not a cave. It was not dug into a hillside. It was constructed in open flat ground, its floor set 4 feet below the surrounding grade, its walls rising 6 feet above that excavated floor to create an interior ceiling height of 10 feet at the center. From the outside, once completed, it would stand only 2 feet above the surface of the field, barely visible, easily mistaken for a low rise in the prairie, which is precisely what it would appear to be and precisely the point. The ground does something at 4 feet of depth that it does not do at the surface. At the surface, the earth follows the air, freezing in winter, warming in summer, responding to whatever the sky sends down with a kind of loyal faithfulness that is very hard on the things you are trying to keep alive through January. But at 4 feet, the earth has its own temperature, not the temperature of the season, not the temperature of the air above it, but a temperature it maintains through the year with the consistency of a principle rather than a mood. In Dakota Territory, that temperature was approximately 54 degrees Fahrenheit. It had been 54 degrees before any European set foot on the plain, and it would be 54 degrees long after the last one left. A floor at 4 feet below grade is a floor that sits on 54-degree ground year-round. In winter, when the air above the surface is 20 below zero, the floor of an house is resting on earth that is 80 degrees warmer than the air outside. The structure does not need to generate warmth from nothing. It needs only to hold what the earth has already provided and add modestly to it. This changes the entire mathematics of winter heating in a way that no frame house, however well built, can replicate, because a frame house sits on the surface and the surface belongs to the weather. Ingrid understood this not as a theory, but as a fact she had experienced in the storage buildings her father made, the way you stepped down into them in January and felt the temperature change on the way down the entry steps, the way grain stored at that depth stayed stable through seasons that spoiled anything kept above ground. She was not applying a principle she had reasoned out. She was building the thing she had seen work in a new country with different clay and different grass and the same cold physics. The excavation took 12 days of steady work. She moved the displaced clay to the east side of the footprint, grading it into a low berm that would eventually help deflect the north wind away from the structure's back wall. Nothing was wasted. Her father had taught her that in construction, the material you remove is half the material you have. Anna Kaufman appeared on a Saturday near the end of October when the excavation was complete and Ingrid had begun setting out the cured fiber clay blocks for the first course of the walls. Anna was 31 years old and had been widowed 2 years. She lived 4 miles north on a half-section she had been managing alone since her husband died. And she was, in the way of capable people who are also honest with themselves, aware that she was managing but not thriving, maintaining but not building. She had heard the same story the rest of the settlement had heard, the widow Voss and her strange hole in the field, and she had not believed it was grief because she knew grief from the inside, and it did not look like digging a straight foundation trench. She rode over to see for herself. She tied her horse at the fence and walked to where Ingrid was kneeling at the northeast corner of the excavation, fitting the first blocks of the wall course. The blocks were laid without mortar, fitted stone tight, each one chosen for how its weight settled against its neighbor. Ingrid was working with a level and a piece of string line pulled from corner stake to corner stake, checking the course as she went. Anna stood and watched for a while without speaking. Then she looked at the block pile, at the canvas drying rack still set up against the barn, at the clay berm to the east, at the cattail fiber in the wooden form drying in the thin October sun. She looked at all of it the way a person looks at a sentence when they are reading slowly enough to understand it. She walked to the second spade leaning against the foundation wall, the spare spade, Heinrich's spade, the one Ingrid had not returned to Lars because she was still using it for the clay mixing, and picked it up. Ingrid looked up at her. "Have you laid block before?" she asked. Anna said she had not. Ingrid looked at her for a moment. The fiber goes through the mix evenly, not in clumps. If you find a clump, break it apart before you press the form. She turned back to the wall. The forms are there. The fiber is in the sack by the barn door. The clay for mixing is in the pile, not the berm. The berm clay has too much surface debris in it. Anna set down the spade and went to the forms. She had not asked if she could help. Ingrid had not told her she could. They had arrived, by separate routes, at the same practical understanding. The work needed doing. There were 2 of them, and explaining this to each other would have taken longer than simply beginning. That is how the Erd house acquired its second builder, and that is where I will pause because what happened next, what the walls became and what came to test them, that requires its own telling. There is a thing that happens in Dakota in the last week of October that is not yet winter and is no longer autumn and has no good name in any language I have found. The light changes first, flattening, losing the angle that gives October its particular gold, becoming instead a pale and directionless white that makes the plain look larger than it is and closer to the sky. The wind shifts to the northwest and steadies there, not gusting but sustained, with a patience that feels deliberate. The ground in the morning has frost in it that does not leave by noon. Old-timers read these signs the way sailors read watercolor, not as poetry, but as information, specific and actionable. What they said in the settlements along the James River in those years was simply, "It is coming." Everyone knew what it meant. Nobody needed to say it twice. Ingrid knew it too. She had spent 19 Octobers on the Dakota Plain, and she understood the particular urgency of that last week, the way it compressed time, made every hour of good weather feel like something being spent rather than something being lived. She and Anna had been working the wall courses for 10 days by then, and the walls had reached 3 feet above the excavated floor. 14 feet of wall remained. The roof frame had not yet been touched. The interior work, floor packing, entry construction, the small iron stove and its chimney pipe, was still entirely ahead of them. She was behind where she needed to be. Not catastrophically behind, measurably behind. She did not say this to Anna. She adjusted her schedule and worked 1 hour longer each day and said nothing about it. The wall failure happened on the 29th of October, and it was not the weather that caused it. I want to be precise about this because I have told this story many times over the years, and I have noticed the tendency, in myself as much as in anyone, to soften the moment by attributing the failure to rain or wind or some external force, as though the wall fell because the world conspired against it. The wall fell because my grandmother's memory was imperfect, and imperfect memory in construction is not a character flaw, but a technical problem. And technical problems require technical solutions, not consolation. What had happened was this. In mixing the batch of blocks for the upper courses of the east wall, Ingrid had adjusted the fiber ratio. She had done this deliberately, believing she was correcting for the drier conditions of late October, which she reasoned might require a slightly wetter mix to ensure proper curing. The reasoning was sound. The execution was slightly wrong. She added more water to compensate for the drier air, then added slightly more fiber to balance the wetter clay, and in doing so, moved the ratio past the point her father's technique required, past the threshold where fiber and clay reinforce each other, and into the range where the fiber begins to act as a weakness in the matrix rather than a strength, creating planes along which the dried block will split under load. She did not know she had done this. The blocks looked correct. They dried in the expected time. She laid them in the expected manner. On the morning of the 29th, Anna arrived to find Ingrid standing at the east wall, looking at a section of the upper course that had developed a horizontal crack along the third block from the left, a clean fracture running the full width of the block and propagating faintly into the mortar joint below. By afternoon, the crack had widened enough to pass a knife blade. By the following morning, when the night temperature had gone to 22 degrees and back, the section shifted inward, and the upper 6 blocks of the east wall's north half came down. Ingrid stood and looked at it for a long time. I know how long because Anna recorded it. She wrote, "She stood still for what I counted as 12 minutes. I did not speak. I understood that she was not standing still. She was working, and the work happening was in her mind, not her hands, and interrupting it would have cost more than waiting." What Ingrid was doing in those 12 minutes was not despairing. She was reasoning backward from the failure to its cause, the way her father had taught her, not what went wrong, but where in the sequence did the error enter. She went through each decision she had made in mixing that batch. She arrived at the ratio. She sat down on the ground, on cold clay in October air, and worked out, without any instrument but memory and logic, where the ratio had gone and what the correct one was. She had made the mix too wet and compensated incorrectly. The fiber content needed to go down when the clay went wet, not up. Her father had told her this. She could hear him telling her, not as a general principle, but in the middle of a specific afternoon beside the Vistula, responding to a specific mistake she had made at 14 years old with a specific batch of clay. She had not recalled the memory in 40 years. It returned now with the precision that practical memories have when the conditions that form them are repeated with sufficient exactness. She stood up. She moved the failed blocks to the discard pile. She told Anna the corrected ratio. They mixed a new batch. The east wall cost them 6 days, 5 days lost to the failure, and 1 day gained back by working until dark. When the rebuilt section was complete and curing, Ingrid ran her hand along the coarse joints in the early morning, feeling for the slight give that indicated inadequate curing, and found none. The wall was solid. She knocked on it once with her knuckle, the way her father had always knocked on finished work, not testing it exactly but acknowledging it. A small ceremony with no audience. Reverend Dorothy Haas came on the 1st of November, which was the day the thermometer outside the Bergstrom farmhouse, the nearest reliable instrument in the settlement, read 18 degrees at mid-morning and did not rise above 22 for the remainder of the day. She was 67 years old and had been riding circuit through the Mennonite settlements of southeastern Dakota for 11 years, covering a route that stretched across 3 counties and required her to be on horseback in weather that would have kept most people indoors. She was not a woman given to excessive comfort or to the assumption that difficulty was a sign of divine displeasure. What she was, in ways she would have been the first to acknowledge, was certain about her faith, certain about her community, and certain about what a woman of that community ought to look like when she was living correctly. A 54-year-old widow building a semi-subterranean earth structure alone on the Dakota Plain did not, in Dorothy Haas's understanding of correct living, meet the criteria. She arrived to find Ingrid outside in the cold, working on the wall's 4th course with the focused economy of motion that Anna had by then learned to recognize as her highest register of concentration. The structure's footprint was fully enclosed to waist height. The compressed earth blocks had developed, in the weeks of curing, a surface color somewhere between dark amber and old bone, not unpleasant, but utterly unlike any building material Dorothy had seen used in the territory. Dorothy delivered her concern with the care of someone who had practiced delivering hard things gently. She spoke about the community, its willingness to help, its resources that had not been asked upon. She spoke about the appearance of the structure, which she described, without meaning cruelty, as resembling a burial mound. She spoke about what it said, or might say, or might be taken to say, about a woman's relationship to hope when she chose to put herself below the surface of the ground before the winter had even properly arrived. It was a thorough concern. It took several minutes. Ingrid set down her trowel and listened to all of it without interruption. When Dorothy finished, Ingrid did not answer with words. She turned to the drying rack beside the wall and took down a block that had been curing since the previous afternoon, a second ratio block, mixed correctly, 20 hours in dry, cold air. She held it out to Dorothy without explanation. Dorothy took it, as people take things that are handed to them before they have decided whether they want them. She held the block in both hands. It was the size of a large book and heavier than it looked. She stood with it for a moment, and then, because the morning was 18 degrees and her hands were cold from the ride, she felt what anyone would feel when holding a block of compressed earth that has been sitting in a sheltered drying rack. It was not warm exactly, but it was warmer than the air around it, warmer than the fence post she had tied her horse to, warmer than the boards of the wall behind Ingrid. It had held something from the previous day's thin sunlight and had not given it up in the night. This was not dramatic. It was simply and quietly true. Ingrid picked up her trowel and went back to work. Dorothy stood holding the block for what I imagine was a considerable time, though no one recorded it. When she set it down, she set it carefully on the top course of the wall, not dropping it back onto the rack, but placing it there with a deliberateness that suggested she was aware she was doing something. Then she told Ingrid she would pray for the work to go well. Ingrid thanked her without looking up. Dorothy untied her horse and rode on to the next farm on her circuit. She did not say the structure was sound. She did not say she had been wrong about the burial mound. She placed the block on the wall and left, and the conversation was over, and whatever had shifted in her understanding of things shifted in silence, the way most real changes do. Two Kettles woman appeared on a Tuesday in the second week of November when the walls were at full height and the roof frame had just gone up. Rough cottonwood poles laid across the wall tops, their ends notched to sit without shifting, covered with a layer of brushwood and waiting for the sod. She came from the direction of the river bottom, walking along the field edge at a pace that suggested she was going somewhere else, and had paused. She stopped perhaps 40 yards from the structure and looked at it for a long time. Then she walked a slow perimeter around it, not approaching closely, studying it from different angles, the way you study a thing you are trying to place, fitting it against some internal catalog, looking for the match. She did not speak to Ingrid. She did not approach. After perhaps 20 minutes, she continued in the direction she had been walking and was gone. Ingrid watched her go and said nothing, and did not call out, and went back to the roof frame. Anna, who had been watching from the other side of the structure, came around and asked who that was. Ingrid told her. Anna asked if she should have said something. "She'll come back if she has something to say," Ingrid said. "If she doesn't come back, she didn't." The sod cutting began on the 12th of November. This was the part of the construction Ingrid was least certain about, and the only part she did not discuss with Anna, because discussing uncertainty, in her understanding of things, was useful only when the other person could help resolve it, and Anna did not yet know enough to help with this. The problem was the roof pitch. Her father had built his storage structures with a specific roof angle, shallow enough that sod could be laid without sliding, steep enough that spring melt would drain cleanly rather than pooling. She could see him setting the angle in her memory, the string line he ran from ridgepole to eave, the way he sighted along it, the adjustment he made once and did not make again. But the number, the specific ratio of rise to run that he had used, would not come. She could see the line. She could not recover the measurement behind it. She made a decision. She built the pitch she judged to be closest to what she remembered, checked it against her recollection as carefully as she could, and did not revise it further. She noted in the notebook, in smaller writing than usual, as though she did not entirely want to record it. Roof pitch by judgment. Will know if correct when first heavy snow comes, cannot know before. She did not tell Anna. She set the ridgepole at the angle she had chosen and began cutting sod the next morning, working from the river bottom where the grass was thickest, lifting each section with a flat spade in intact squares, grass side up, roots holding the soil together, the living mat that would, when laid in overlapping courses across the brushwood, become the final and most important layer of the structure. The sod was heavy. Each square weighed more than it looked and tended to break apart at the corners if lifted without care. She and Anna worked in a rhythm, Ingrid cutting, Anna carrying, for 4 days. By the 4th day, Anna was arriving an hour later than she had in previous weeks, and Ingrid noticed that her hands, when she arrived, had the particular roughness of someone who had been cutting firewood in the dark hours before dawn, making up for time spent away from her own preparations. On the morning of the 5th day, Ingrid told Anna to go home an hour earlier than Anna wanted to leave. Anna started to object. "Your firewood?" Ingrid said. "Not unkindly. You're behind on it. I can see it in your hands." Anna was quiet for a moment. Then she went back to carrying sod without argument and left an hour earlier, and Ingrid worked alone in the last light, laying the final courses of the roof herself in the thin cold of a November dusk that smelled, faintly and unmistakably, of coming snow. 2 Kettles woman came back the next morning. She walked directly to the structure this time, no perimeter, no long observation from a distance. She stepped up onto the roof frame where the sod had not yet been laid and stood on the brushwood, testing the flex with her weight. She crouched and looked at the sod courses already laid, checking the thickness, lifting a corner of one section to see how the roots had been cut. Then she stood up and said, "You are not cutting the sod thick enough." Ingrid looked up at her. How thick? 2 Kettles woman held her hands apart, 10 inches, perhaps slightly more. What followed was not a long conversation, and it was not a short one. It was a practical exchange between 2 people who had no common language for the general and sufficient common language for the specific, which is, in construction, the only language that finally matters. 2 Kettles woman showed Ingrid the correct thickness by demonstration, lifting an already laid section and replacing it with the gap her hands had indicated. She showed her the direction of lay relative to where the prevailing wind would press hardest against the roof. She indicated, with a stick drawn across the ridge, the line along which a thin seeding of living grass should be encouraged to grow, binding the courses together over time the way a scar binds the edges of a wound. She also told her something about the pitch. She stood at the eave and sighted along the roof angle, and she said, "This will hold snow. In spring the water will need help." She described with her hands a slight channel cut along the base of each eave, a diversion to carry meltwater away from the wall junction, where it would otherwise pool and work its way into the wall base through freeze and thaw cycles. Ingrid looked at the roof pitch she had built by judgment. It was not wrong. It was close. It needed the eave channel, which she had not planned for and which would take half a day to add. She added it. Before Two Kettles woman left, she said one more thing. Mandan build this way. On the Missouri, 8 winters I spent in a Mandan lodge. The cold did not come in. Ingrid set down her spade. My father built this way on the Vistula. Different river. Two Kettles woman looked at the structure, the earth walls, the sod roof, the south-facing entry set to catch the low winter sun. She nodded once with the economy of someone who has said what needed saying and considers the matter concluded. Then she walked back toward the river bottom and was gone. She had come back because she had decided the work was worth engaging with. The distinction, my grandmother told me once, mattered more than anything she said. The structure was complete on the 14th of November. The thermometer at the Bergstrom farm read 28 degrees that morning. Ingrid carried her bedding and her cooking things and her small store of food down the entry steps and into the interior, which smelled of earth and dried grass and the faint iron and ash smell of the small stove she had set in the northeast corner and fired for the first time the night before to test the draw. The draw was good. The smoke moved through the short chimney pipe and out into the November air without hesitation, without backing, without the sideways behavior that indicates a problem in the flue geometry. She let it burn for 2 hours, then let it go out, and waited to see what the walls held. She held her hand flat against the interior wall face in the morning. The wall was not warm. It was less cold than the air in the room, which was itself less cold than the air outside, and the floor beneath her feet was less cold than either. She opened the notebook and wrote the first entry. November 14th, outside, 28, inside, 51. No fire since yesterday morning. 51 degrees Fahrenheit inside a structure built from river clay and cattail grass, and the remembered knowledge of a man who had been dead for 20 years, while the Dakota plain outside went about the business of becoming winter. She closed the notebook. She put water on the stove to boil for coffee. Outside, the northwest wind moved across the sod roof with a sound she had not heard before, not the sharp percussion of wind against wood boards, but something lower and more patient, a sound like weather passing over ground, which is exactly what it was. She had 11 cords of wood left to get through. She had, if the walls held, enough fuel to last until April. She did not yet know whether the walls would hold. She would know by February. The hard winter of 1880 to 1881 did not announce itself. That is the thing about the worst winters. They do not arrive with any particular drama that distinguishes them from ordinary bad winters until you are already inside them and the exits have closed. The cold came in mid-December and settled over the Dakota plain with the quiet permanence of something that has decided to stay. The James River, which ran shallow and slow at the best of times, went solid in the first week and stayed solid. The temperature dropped to -22 on the 15th of December and did not recover above zero for 11 consecutive days. When it finally rose, it rose only to -4, as though offering a brief reminder of what warmth had once been before taking it back again. By the end of December, the settlement along the James River had the particular quality of a community that is managing but has stopped pretending the management is comfortable. Families were rationing. The Hofer family, 3 miles north, had begun breaking apart the rail fence on their east boundary for fuel, which everyone understood to be the kind of decision you do not make unless the alternative is worse. The Fisher family, Jacob and Hilda and their 4 children, who had come from Ohio the previous spring and had arrived too late in the season to build as well as they needed, had approximately 2 weeks of fuel remaining as January began, and no clear plan for what came after. Lars Bergstrom came to Ingrid's door on the 4th of January. He came at mid-morning, which meant he had waited until he was sure Anna would not be there. He would not have wanted a witness to the visit, and I think he knew that Ingrid would understand this and not mention it. He knocked. She opened the door. He stepped inside because she stepped back to let him, and then he stopped. I know what he felt because he described it to me himself, 30 years later, when he was an old man and I was in my 40s, and we were sitting in his kitchen on a winter afternoon not unlike that one. He said, "I had been cold for 3 weeks without a single day of relief. Not dangerously cold, I was managing, I want to be clear about that, but the kind of cold that becomes the whole world after a while. You forget what your face feels like when it isn't hurting. You forget that there is a version of indoors that is genuinely warm rather than just less cold than outdoors." He paused. I walked into that room and my face stopped hurting. Not gradually, just stopped. I stood there for I don't know how long before I remembered I had come to say something. What he said when he remembered was practical and brief. He told her his fuel situation. He did not ask for anything. He presented the facts the way a man presents facts when he knows the conclusion they point toward, but cannot bring himself to name it directly. Ingrid went to the corner where her fuel was stacked, cottonwood rounds and dried buffalo chips, still more than half of her winter supply at the rate she had been burning, and measured out a bundle with the precision of someone calculating to the cord, not to generosity or stinginess, but to what the arithmetic actually required. She set it by the door. "Come back when that is gone," she said. Lars looked at the bundle. He looked at the interior wall, the compressed earth face with its faint fiber texture, the tallow-finished surface that had taken on a slight polish from weeks of lamplight. He reached out and pressed his palm flat against it for a moment. He took his hand away. He looked at his palm as though it had told him something he was not entirely ready to hear. He picked up the bundle and left. He did not say she had been right. He did not say he had been wrong. He said thank you, which in the economy of Lars Bergstrom's speech was a considerable thing, and walked out into the January air. He came back 3 more times before March. On the 4th visit, he stayed for 2 hours and walked every wall, every floor junction, every corner where the earth mass met the ceiling. He ran his hands along surfaces with the slow attention of someone who is trying to learn something through his palms rather than his eyes. Ingrid let him look. She answered his questions when he had them and did not fill the silence when he didn't. He never said a word about it publicly. Not that winter, not the following spring, not in any gathering of the settlement community that anyone recorded or remembered. What he said was in his hands in April, when he began excavating the southwest corner of his grain storage building. But that comes later. Before April, there was the 19th of January. 2 Kettles women came to the Erd House door at 4 o'clock in the afternoon of the 19th, when the sky to the northwest had already taken on the flat white opacity that precedes a serious storm, and the temperature had dropped 6 degrees in 2 hours. She was snow-dusted and direct. She had been moving toward the river bottom, as she did when serious weather came, and she had seen something on the way. "There is a family," she said. "Broken wagon. 2 miles north, near the creek crossing." Ingrid did not ask how she knew or how long they had been there. She asked how many. 6. 4 children. I should tell you something I have not yet told you because it is relevant now and it was not relevant before. In the autumn of 1880, I was 12 years old. My mother's farm was 3 miles from my grandmother's land. On 3 afternoons each week after school let out, I walked those 3 miles and carried clay blocks from the drying rack to the wall. My grandmother did not ask me to come. I simply came, the way children come to things that seem important without being able to explain why. She did not praise me for it, which I understood even then to mean she was taking me seriously. She handed me work and explained things only when I needed the explanation to do the work correctly, and I carried blocks and watched and said almost nothing for 11 weeks. I was not there on the 19th of January. I am telling you what happened from my grandmother's account, and from what 2 Kettles woman said to Anna Kaufman in the spring, when Anna's notebook was still being written, and Two Kettles woman was willing once to describe it. My grandmother put on every layer she owned. She put on Heinrich's coat over her own because it was larger and had better wind resistance, and she had kept it on the hook by the door since July, without being able to explain precisely why. She told me once that she did not think about the house as she left it, did not think about whether the stove was banked correctly or the door hung properly against the wind. She thought about the creek crossing 2 miles north and the temperature and the children. She trusted the walls to do what she had built them to do. That trust was, in its way, the final proof. Not the thermometer reading, not Lars Bergstrom's palm against the wall surface, but the fact that she walked away from the structure in a gathering blizzard without looking back, because she knew it would be there when she returned. She and Two Kettles woman went north together through country that was becoming, as they walked, progressively less legible. The wind had shifted fully northwest by the time they left and was moving snow horizontally across the field surface, erasing the distinction between ground and air. Two Kettles woman navigated by the feel of the frozen creek edge beneath her feet, a slight resistance in the ground that told her where the bank was when the eyes told her nothing, and Ingrid followed in her exact footsteps, close enough to keep her in sight in the whitening air. They found the Fishers at the creek crossing in 40 minutes. The wagon had broken its left front axle on the ice edge, dropping that corner hard enough to throw Jacob Fisher against the seat board and crack 2 ribs. He was upright but gray-faced, breathing in the shallow, careful way of a man in rib pain who has learned that deep breath is a mistake. The horse was tied to the wagon frame and stood with its head down, which meant it had been standing long enough to stop fighting. The children were in the wagon bed under every piece of cloth the family owned. The youngest, Marta, 4 years old, no longer shivering, which was not the relief it appeared to be. Ingrid took Marta and put her inside Heinrich's coat against her chest and held her there with both arms and began walking south. Two Kettles woman assessed Jacob Fisher's ribs by pressing 2 fingers along the rib line with the clinical efficiency of someone who has done this before in conditions that did not allow for careful examination. She told him what was cracked and what was not, and how he needed to move. She unhitched the horse and put the 2 older children on its back, and the second youngest in Jacob's arms, and told him to keep walking regardless of how the ribs felt about it, because stopping was the alternative, and the alternative was not acceptable. They reached the house in 1 hour and 10 minutes. Ingrid opened the door and they went down the entry steps and inside, all 7 of them. 8, counting Two Kettles woman, who came last and pulled the door closed behind her and dropped the bar across it. The temperature outside had reached -34. The wind was moving at speeds that made the snow horizontal and continuous, a white erasure of the world above the surface. Inside, 46 degrees. The morning's fire had been out since before noon. Jacob Fisher sat down on the floor because his legs decided it before he did. Hilda Fisher unwrapped the children one by one and held each face in her hands, checking. Marta's right hand had 2 fingers beginning to show the waxy pallor of early frostbite, and Ingrid saw it and went directly to the stove and built a fire, larger than her usual morning fire, the one exception she permitted herself, and when it had caught, she filled a basin with water from the stored supply and warmed it to a temperature just above body heat. And she put Marta's hand into it and held it there, and she did not rush it. Because cold-damaged tissue heals slowly or not at all, depending on whether you are patient, and patience was the one resource the house had in full supply. The blizzard ran for 21 hours. Outside in those 21 hours, the temperature reached -41. The wind drove snow into drifts against any obstacle, fence lines, barn walls, the slight rise of the house roof, which accumulated 2 feet of packed snow that added, without anyone planning it, another layer of insulation to what was already there. The world above the surface was not survivable. Had the Fishers stayed with the wagon, they would not have been found until the thaw, and they would not have been found alive. Inside, the temperature over the course of the night fell to 43 degrees at its lowest. This is the reading Ingrid noted in the notebook at 4 in the morning, the one entry in all 116 that she wrote in the dark by lamplight. 8 people. A fire that she fed twice through the night, each time a modest addition, never a large one, because the walls were doing what walls are supposed to do, and the fire's job was to supplement, not to compensate. At some point in the second night, Ingrid was not certain of the hour and did not try to record it, Hilda Fisher said, "I have never been inside a wall like this." Ingrid was sitting with Marta's hand still loosely in hers, checking the color of the recovering fingers by lamplight. She looked up. "Most people haven't," she said. "Why not?" Ingrid thought about it for a moment. It was a genuine question, and it deserved a genuine answer. "Because the people who knew how to build this way are mostly where I came from. And the people here came from somewhere else where they built differently. Nobody wrote it down because it seemed obvious to the ones who knew it." Hilda was quiet. Then, "Someone should write it down." Ingrid looked at the shelf where Anna's notebook sat in its usual place, half filled with Anna's careful hand, the accumulated record of 11 weeks of questions and answers. "Someone is," she said, and turned back to Marta's hand and did not say anything further because there was nothing further that needed saying. Word of the night traveled through the settlement the way all news traveled in those years, person to person, stopping at each farm, arriving altered by each telling, but preserving in its center the facts that mattered. The Fisher family, the broken wagon, the Aird house, 43 degrees inside while the world outside froze solid. These were not disputable facts. Jacob Fisher's cracked ribs were not disputable. Marta Fisher's recovering fingers were not disputable. The thermometer reading that Ingrid had noted at 4 in the morning was not disputable, and she showed it to everyone who asked, and some who did not. The settlement did not erupt into enthusiasm. It did not hold a meeting or pass a resolution or organize a delegation to thank Ingrid or acknowledge her publicly in any gathering that was recorded. What it did was quieter and more durable than any of those things. It watched, and it calculated, and it adjusted. Lars Bergstrom broke ground on his grain storage annex in April when the frost had left the first 2 feet of soil. 3 neighbors rode by on the second day and asked him what he was doing. He told them. 2 of them came back the following Saturday with their own spades. He did not tell them where he had learned what he was teaching them, because he was Lars Bergstrom, and he did not speak about things he had not yet fully resolved within himself, and his feelings about that winter were not yet fully resolved. But his hands knew what to do, and his neighbors' hands learned from watching his. And in this way the knowledge moved without requiring anyone to make a speech about it. Reverend Dorothy Haas preached that autumn on the parable of the talents, specifically the talent buried in the earth, which is the one the parable treats as a failure. She argued, carefully and without naming anyone, that the parable was perhaps misread if one imagined that burying a thing in earth was always an act of fear. Sometimes, she said, you put something in the earth because the earth is the right place for it. Because the earth will hold it at a temperature that nothing above the surface can match, through seasons that would destroy it anywhere else. The congregation followed her meaning. She accepted their understanding as the closest she could bring herself to come. Anna Kaufman's notebook eventually ran to 34 pages. She titled it simply and sent copies to 3 Mennonite communities in Kansas and Nebraska, where they were copied again and circulated under the name The Prairie Method, a name that told you nothing about where it came from or who had remembered it into existence in a Dakota field in October of 1880. Ingrid's name was in the dedication, to I.V., who remembered. That was all. It was, in Anna's judgment, precisely enough and not one word more. I closed the notebook and set it on the table between us. Carl Hofer was still sitting where I had put him 3 hours before, coat long since shed, coffee cup empty and refilled twice. Outside my kitchen window, the January field lay under 8 inches of new snow, smooth and directionless in the flat winter light. He said, "I won't plow it under." I nodded. I stood and took his cup and refilled it a third time, and stood at the window with my own cup and looked out at the field. Below that field, 4 feet down, beneath the frost and the frozen root zone and the packed clay that Carl's plow had not yet reached, the earth was doing what it had always done. No fire, no fuel, no effort of any kind, just the slow, patient physics of depth, the accumulated warmth of a planet that has been at this longer than any of us, holding its temperature against the season with a steadiness that nothing built above the surface has ever quite matched. 54 degrees. It was 54 degrees the autumn my grandmother stood at the edge of the cattail stand and understood what she was looking at. It was 54 degrees on the morning she held a clay block against her face and let her skin decide. It was 54 degrees beneath the floor of the house on the night the temperature outside reached 41 below, and 8 people slept warm inside walls made of river clay and cattail grass and the remembered knowledge of a man who had built things beside a river on the other side of the world. It is 54 degrees this morning beneath Carl Hofer's field, beneath the foundation, his plow turned up. The earth does not forget what it has been asked to hold.